And so with that, we'll start Act 1, Departure. And so the ordinary world, Act 1, Scene 1. And so every story has obviously a protagonist. So this is my protagonist, who's called Sammy Serverless. And Sammy Serverless is a server worker, or some people might call them a DevOps person, which means that Sammy is in charge of maintaining all the servers, making sure that the DevOps things are up to date. I'm a front-end developer. I clearly don't understand how DevOps works. But I assume it's like, you know, you have a bunch of like circuits and things like that, and you know how things work. And so Sammy has a whiteboard in which Sammy writes down all of the things that she needs to know in order for things to work. And as long as this whiteboard is not erased, Sammy knows how everything is work and all systems are go. And Sammy works for a company called Buen Appetito, which is a company that builds recipes and various prep things to help people in the kitchen with things that they cook or whatever you do in the kitchen. And so Buen Appetito is a very localized company, or they try to be very local even though they're pretty international. And so they're building a new application which is rating pizza places in Chicago, because obviously that's what people care about in Chicago. I localize talks a lot, so I created a Boston one, which is where it was localizing, or it was reviewing lobster, because that's the only thing you do in Boston, really. You run and you eat lobster. And in Chicago, you eat pizza and like a bunch of other stuff, which is why I'm here now. And so in this application, there's a way for seeing all the various places that give you really good pizza. You see it on a map, and then you also see where we are. And so you kind of have that relative format, which is really nice. And so for that application, it's kind of a full stack app at the moment, kind of theoretically. So you have your front end, you have your back end, you have your database, you have your whatever else, routing, etc. And so all of that works. Why doesn't this go next? Hold on. Okay. And so this is where the step or the story begins, which is the application becomes incredibly popular and goes on the Orange News site, top 1, which means that everyone's clicking on it, everyone's using it, which is great because, you know, companies want revenue and they want people to use their stuff. But the problem is that all of the servers are on fire, because that's what happens when your site becomes popular. Like, I don't know, servers get hot and fire happens, I think. And you obviously, as a developer, from the front end, you see this 503 service unavailable, assuming you're using Cloudflare or whatever tool you're using. This doesn't happen in Netlify. Just kidding. And so Sammy is very frustrated because Sammy's like, wait, this shouldn't be happening. And of course, Sammy, being very resourceful, is like, I obviously have a solution, and it's written somewhere in this whiteboard as long as I can decipher it. And the solution is, of course, this idea that we need a bigger server rack, because, you know, we don't have enough servers, we need more servers, therefore we need more server racks. And so Sammy talks to the manager says, okay, let's build more servers, because, I don't know, that's how decisions are made. And then they get a bunch of servers, which is great, because now all of the users have a way of accessing the website. The servers are serving the website appropriately and can handle that load, which is wonderful. But unfortunately, as most websites and applications on the Orange News site go, it's often a flash in the pan. So it's popular, and then it is no longer popular. And so with time, servers get less and less used. So there's a lot of wastage that happens. There's a lot of money and effort going into maintaining servers that are no longer being used. So this is very upsetting, obviously, because there's a lot of money that goes into it. And so Sammy's manager tells her that she will obviously lose her job if she does not fix this problem as soon as possible. So it's kind of like really frustrating, because this whiteboard obviously has the answer to life, the universe, and everything, although 42 is not on there. And so Sammy is like, this is annoying because I obviously have done this for a really long time. I know what's happening, but this is not the solution. I don't know what's happening. And so Sammy, in a fit of frustration, decides to scribble on the whiteboard, because it hasn't been erased in a really long time, so you can't erase it anymore. And so Sammy decides that it's time for her to take a walk, because, you know, what else do you do when you're frustrated? Take a walk. And so this is where Sammy sees this particular person on the side of the road, obviously a very wise person on the side of the road, who goes by the name of Swami Scale-a-lot. And this person knows a lot about scaling, as the name probably suggests. knows a lot about scaling systems and how things work. And so as most wise people on the side of the road tell you, in very cryptic terms, men who run servers without servers accomplish many things, which means things but nothing at the same time. So it's very confusing. Sammy doesn't understand what's happening, obviously. Like, what does that mean? But Sammy decides, like, I don't have any options, so let me think about this. Sometimes talking to people on the side of the road can lead to good things. And so Sammy thinks about it and starts to look at the application at a deeper context. So maybe changing the way that the application is built from the ground up. And so we have a full stack application, but maybe we can split everything up into services. Instead of having everything be coupled together, we can decouple it. And then maybe we can go one step further and put everything on the cloud, because then we don't have to maintain and make sure that those services are always up and available. We can put them on the cloud, someone else can manage it. And so Sammy decides, fine, I'm a server worker, I've done this for a while, but maybe it's time for me to have someone else deal with the problem that I'm currently facing. And so Sammy decides to go on, put her head in the clouds, essentially, which is the initiation of our journey. So Act 2, initiation. And this is the point where Sammy is met with a lot of tests and enemies within the company, because everyone's like, hey, did you know that there are servers in serverless? Which is true, very true. Another thing that happens with working with on the cloud is that there is this thing called cold start, because you obviously are not maintaining the servers are not up all the time, the servers are only used when you invoke them, so there's this concept of cold starts, which is really annoying. But of course, Sammy is one who perseveres and decides, like, whatever, I'm gonna talk to my manager, I'm gonna get the okay, manager says okay, let's do it. And so now is where the challenge and the ordeal happens, so the innermost cave. So we have to actually take this application and make it decoupled, or make it a little bit less of a full stack app. So we'll start with the first piece. So this is a Mapbox app, very similar to the previous talk by Weston, where he was talking about Mapbox. We're going to talk about Mapbox too, yay. And so the first thing to do with this application is those specific points that you see on the map. So there's data associated with them. Specifically, what we're doing here is we're cheating a little. I'm pulling from Yelp, because Yelp already has data, instead of having to create it on your own. And so in order to do that, I need to call the Yelp API. And the Yelp API is really specific, because you need a backend in order to call that API. Security, there's various quirks with it. And so when you build a full stack application, you would use something like Express. So I'm using Express here. This is the full stacky way of doing it. You can have an Express server, and then obviously you have an ability, you create your own route. So in this case, it's /yelpit/the term /location. So you can pass in query parameters. And then obviously Yelp has specific things you need to do. So you need an access token. And then you need to initiate the client, and then with that you can run the search. So this is very Yelp specific. But the other thing that you need to know when you're building your own server or a full stack app is that oftentimes you need to proxy your own dev server. So when you're working on dev, you often have to create this proxy, because if something's running locally, you run into CORS issues, which is really frustrating. So you have to do this step in order for that to work. So that's the target. So that allows me to access that specific port without me having CORS issues. And so that's great. But what we can make it better is that we're working with serverless stuff. And so this is where functions as a service is. It's often conflated. Whenever people talk about serverless, they actually mean functions as a service, which is what I'm talking about. And for functions as a service, I'm going to be using Netlify. And surprise, Netlify is actually run by AWS Lambda under the hood. But the nice thing is that you don't have to configure API Gateway, which is, if you've ever worked with API Gateway, a pain, horrible. And with Netlify, it's pretty easy, because you just create your JavaScript function, you put it on Netlify, and it works. And so to work with Netlify functions, all you do is you create a single JavaScript file, you create a folder called functions, and then here you have a hello.js file. So pretty basic. There's nothing much to it. But what we can do also to make it much easier is you could do it by hand, but Netlify gives you a CLI that allows you to do a lot of these things quite easily. So Tracy was mentioning that CLIs make it much easier because developer experience is enhanced. And so Netlify gives you this CLI, which then allows you to create functions kind of really easily. So you don't have to go mkdir, whatever, create file, or like copy paste new folder, whatever you do. which then gives you the ability to create your own function itself. The other thing that you can do, that you have to do in order for this to work is this TOML file. So if you were to create a Netlify CLI, it automatically gives you this whenever you run functions create. It gives you this access to this TOML file, and specifically what is being run and what we'll be using for our function to work is this functions piece. So in this TOML file is the functions equals functions. All that's doing is it's pointing and telling Netlify, hey, the function that you're running is in this folder. So it's telling it where exactly to point to. And so if you were to deploy that, this is what the dashboard looks like on Netlify. You'll see all the functions. Obviously, this is like a separate application I built, which is specific to authentication, but you see a bunch of functions that you have run and are running from your dashboard itself. And so that gives you access to deploy logs, things like that, that might be important when you're debugging your application. And the other nice thing whenever you're doing serverless stuff is you want that endpoint. And so previously I was talking about Express. You have to run your own dev server, really annoying, you have to proxy, all that kind of stuff. But if you're using a service like Netlify, I believe Azure does something similar as well, is that you get access to this endpoint. So if you run your front-end application, you automatically get access to that proxy. You don't have to do it yourself. So in this case, it's /.netlify/functions, whatever the name is. So in this case, it's hello, but no, not to put the .js because that will not work. So it has to be just the name of the file itself. And so in our case, we're calling it yelp-it, so yelp it, just whatever you want to call it. And so what we'll do now is we'll create that specific function that we are trying to invoke. So creating a Netlify function is pretty standard. If you've worked already with AWS Lambda, it's exactly the same thing. If you've written JavaScript, it's pretty much very similar. You create a handler, and then within that, we're doing the exact same thing that we did in our Express example. We're creating the client, we're grabbing the query string parameters, and then after that, we're also like running a function called fetch from Yelp. So we're doing that search in and of itself, and then in the callback body, we're just sending that data back down. And so quite easily, we're able to like invoke the function, grab the data that we need, and then pull it back into our application. And I talk about Vue a lot. I'm wearing a Vue shirt. So all of the examples here are in Vue, so I apologize if you don't understand Vue. It's actually really simple. But you can just adapt it in your head to like whatever framework you choose to use. So in this case, this is a single page application in Vue, or a single file component, excuse me, in Vue. All we're doing is I have a component called slider, which is that side component I showed you that has all of the links. And all we're doing is like we have this Yelp data, which is a data property, and I'm passing it through. So the bulk of what is happening is that in my mounted, which is similar to an onCreated or a lifecycle hook that happens whenever your function is mounted, I'm making that call to my endpoint with the query parameters, and then I'm getting that data, which I can then put, like I have to run it through a GeoJSONify because like similar to what Weston was saying, when you work with maps, there's a very specific format. And then you can just pass it to that data property. And then Vue knows, because it's pretty reactive, it automatically updates and it shows you that data. The other thing that we'll need to do is the reviews part of it. So I'm going to be using Vuex, which is very similar to Redux or Flux or any other like state management system that you've used. And the idea is that it's an ability for you to easily save data to a specific place. So here I'm going to Vuexify the thing that I just talked to you about, which is the Yelp data part. And so for that, we have this idea of state, mutations, and actions. And so in state, we have this concept of Yelp data, which is empty because we haven't made a call, assumedly. And then the second part is this idea of actions, which is actually making that call. So what we're doing here is we're taking the previous example I showed you, which is imperative, and writing everything in your single file component, pulling that piece out into a Vuex component so that you can easily use that in various parts and various components without having to repeat yourself over and over. So I can use that command, I'm just grabbing that data, and then I'm committing it. So it's that idea of an action. And so with Vue, there's like the idea of actions and then mutations. So whenever an action happens, it's like making a call to an API, the mutation is mutating the state. And so there is where the mutation happens. And so again, very similar to the previous app, we have that slider component, but instead of like that long string of lines that we have a very simple way of like grabbing the Vuex stuff, we can create those, we can grab the action, and then we can call the action, and then that gives us access to that state, which we can then use. So it's much simpler, much cleaner, but this is a way of using serverless, but we're also using a Vuex workflow. So it's very view specific, but really nice at the same time. So again, passing it down to that slider component. The next piece is the database piece of it. So I kind of jumped ahead a little bit earlier, but the database piece of it is the reviews part. So to jump into this example, there's this particular piece. So I was pulling data from Yelp, but the idea is that you yourself as a user want to be able to rate the application, rate various pizza places. Because yeah, Pequod's is really popular on Yelp, but like, I don't know, I like Jets, even though it's not Chicago style. And so I might not give Pequod's as high a rating, even, whatever, to each their own. And so for that, we're gonna jump back into our Vuex code, but we're gonna create something specifically for the database aspect. And for this, I'm gonna be using Firebase, because Firebase is really easy, it's really simple. Demoing is super easy as well. You can use any database of your choice, like FaunaDB or anything, but I'm using Firebase. So I'm initializing the data store, specifically Firestore, and then I'm creating an action called set ratings, and all that's doing is it's grabbing, it's setting data specific to like a collection. So in Firebase, there's this idea of a collection, which is where exactly you store your data. I think there's various different terminologies around that, but in Firebase it's called collection. And so with that, in the collection, I'm storing a specific name, and then I'm getting that specific piece. So the idea is like, essentially, from high level perspective, all this is doing is it's grabbing like whatever you click 3 on this specific name, and then it's passing that onto Firebase. I'll have the code available later if you're really interested in this, because it goes really deep in the weeds. But if you're really interested, I'll share that with you later. So the ordeal is the next part of it, because we have a sort of working application. Everything works, super high level. But the next step is this idea of authentication, because I mentioned this idea of users and people being able to rate things on their own. And so my rating is obviously different from yours. And so the application needs a way of authenticating or signing and signing out users. And so for this, I'm using Netlify Identity, which is actually built on Go. So it's under the hood, it's this application called GoTrue. So Netlify Identity allows you a widget, so it gives you, very similar to Okta, or if you're using Auth0, it gives you that lockbox. So whenever you add it, it's like automatically has everything. GoTrue is a way for you to change the UI, because oftentimes with those screens, you can't change the UI. It gives it to you just out of the box. So we're gonna use GoTrue for this, because I have a very specific way that I want my login flow to work. And so this gives me access to that. And so again, we're gonna jump into Vuex, because Vuex makes it a bit easier, more extrapolated, so we don't have to think about the view logic. We can just think about the functionality. And so for that, I'm just gonna import my GoTrue, so it's a node module, and then I'm going to instantiate it. So I'm gonna pass it in a specific URL. So in this case, this is my Netlify URL. And then the next step is defining the action that needs to happen. And so login is really important. I know sign up is important too, but login is also really important, so we're gonna talk about that. And so for login, I want to do 2 things. So instead of so let's say someone signs up for a service, and then they wanna log in for the first time. They haven't confirmed that they have logged in before. And so instead of having 2 things, which is attempt confirmation and attempt login, I'm just putting those 2 things together. And so I check whether or not that user has been confirmed, which is what this is. And then if they have, then I move on to the login step. So it makes it a bit more succinct, so I don't have to do multiple things. So all this is doing is it's logging in a user using an email and a password, and then it's committing that specific user, which is really nice, because now that the user is saved in Vuex, I can then use it across my application without having to pass that through props or, I don't know, provide injects and various other patterns that you may be familiar with. And so that allows me access in the state. This is the mutation. So I get that user itself. So I'm saving that to a specific state. And so from the front end, you see the application. This is the form. So the form is just like a regular form. It has a @submit.prevent, which calls login whenever that form is submitted. And then this is, again, like a view thing, which is reactivity. So Vue's reactivity system is this idea where whenever a data property changes, it automatically updates without you having to do extra things. So here I'm using a V model that is login creds. And so here you'll see, like, in this particular part is where the data is being defined. So there's the email and the password. That's what's being propagated to the specific form and vice versa. Really easy two-way binding without you having to do much work. And then obviously the login part is what I was talking about, where I mentioned the Vuex action. So I import that action, and then I attempt the login using the credentials that I've given. And then I can transfer them to the dashboard. So again, this is something that is a way of making sure and kind of hand-holding and making sure the UX workflow is really tight. And the transfer dashboard, of course, requires a redirect, because I'm using Vue router on the back end. And in order for that to happen, I need to basically kick the router and tell it, like, hey, if the user automatically, like, or has successfully logged in, like, allow them, or gain them entry into the home of the application. So that's pretty nice. And the nice thing about all of this is the configurability of the system. So because we're using a lot of serverless and cloud functions, we have access to many things. One of them is this idea of roles. So if you're familiar with authentication, oftentimes authentication comes with this term authorization. They're related, but they're not the same thing. So whenever a user is authenticated, you basically give them permission on what they can access. So in this case, I'm the only user in the system. There's this idea of visitor and editor. And so a visitor might have privileges to, like, modify specific things like the reviews, but an editor might be able to change the specific UI, change what the user sees on the front end, and so on. So that allows you access whenever you have a system that's in place like this, where you're not building your own things. You have access to, like, role-based redirects, for example, redirecting based on someone's permissions and so on. The other thing is, I love talking about Vue, so I'm, like, giving you bonus Vue content. So Vue, if you're unfamiliar, is moving to Vue 3. So we're currently at Vue 2. Vue 3 is a huge, like, change in the way Vue is written. If you have ever read Hacker News or Reddit, you might have come across, like, this crazy, like, fight that happened a couple of months ago where people were getting really angry about Vue 3, and they were, like, calling Evan all kinds of names. The idea is that Vue is moving to, like, a compositional API, very similar to React hooks, which was, like, a huge change in the way things are. I'll talk about it in a second. And so the idea of this is this thing where it's like, I'm going to create a reactivity system, so when I click directions, it gives you directions from here to P-quads. Unfortunately, I'm using Mapbox directions, and for some reason it's directing you to walk through the lake to get to P-quads. I don't know why. I checked, and I think it's with the system. Like, the system clearly does not know how Chicago works, and that you cannot walk on water as much as you would like. I think if you use Google, it would be a bit different. I chose to use Mapbox, which sometimes when you use open source stuff, it can be a bit clunky. And so for this particular use case of updating a line string, we're going to be using Mapbox, Netlify, and Vue. And so I mentioned a little bit earlier about Vue changing. So Vue hooks is what everyone called it, but it's not called Vue hooks. It's actually called Vue functions, but then they changed it again, so it's called compositional functions. I don't know if it'll change again. I feel like I have to change this talk constantly because the API keeps changing. It's crazy, it's wild. And so the idea is it's very simple. So this is the reactivity system in Vue. You can think about it like, without thinking about the framework, React will work like this, any framework works like this. It's the idea, here I'm clicking a button and it's incrementing a counter, so it's going up by 1. And the idea of this Vue compositional function is it looks something like this. So instead of, generally speaking, whenever you write Vue applications, you often have your Vue and your functionality both together. And if you want them separate, you would write Vuex. So your Vuex is separate, you have your Vue. But the idea is that the Vue is always tightly coupled with the logic. With Vue compositional functions, you can take the functionality into its own function and then add that to the Vue component, or the basic Vue aspect of V-I-E-W. It's very hard to, like, view, not whatever. And so for this, all I'm doing is I'm creating a specific functionality for incrementing a counter. So there's no aspect of how exactly that counter will look like or what those DOM nodes are, But in this case, all it's doing is functionality. So I define a function called useCounter, and then I return a bunch of variables. So in this case, there's count, there's increment, and there's +1. And so I can then grab that counter in my single file component, and then I can use it quite easily. So they work like variables or any reactive variables, and then I can just like return them and use them quite easily. Ah, why doesn't this work? Hold on. Okay, so in order for all of this to work, we're pulling in like the view part of it. So I talked a little bit about the view. It'll come in handy in a second. But I want to talk a little bit about the serverless piece of it because that's important. The idea is that we need to make a call to get those directions, because like we're like, hey, how do we get from here to here? And so for that, I'm going to create an endpoint called directions. And so all it's doing is creating a call to like a specific API endpoint with like query parameters, and then it's returning that data. There's nothing else to it. It's quite simple. But the piece that is really like kind of the bulk and meat of the view piece is what I call useDrawLine. And I'm grabbing from, there's a specific node package. So if any of you are interested in Vue 3, someone's created a node package called Composition API, which is kind of like very similar to the RFC, but not exactly similar. But it allows you to play around with like whatever Vue 3 stuff is. So then I define a specific function called useDrawLine, and then I define like the variable or the reactive property that I want to like update. So in this case, it's that line string, so like whatever that GeoJSON piece is needs to be updated. And ref is important because that's kind of what makes it reactive. It's kind of the magic of what is happening here. And then, of course, like I'm not going to go through the function because it's actually quite crazy. But the idea is I'm using a request animation frame, which is what is updating that specific line string and drawing it. And then, of course, for every point in time, I'm updating that value property. So .value is how you access that reactive property, and then you pass it your new value as you go through. So that's what the reactivity piece of it is. And then, of course, you return that specific data property within this, so then you can use it. So now in my specific single file component, I can grab that specific function. I can now run that function like so. And then in a watcher, so a watcher is Vue's way of checking whether a data property has been updated. So whenever you create a data property, whenever it's updated, the watcher gets fired, which is a nice way for you to make sure that you know whenever something is changing in your system. So within a watcher, I can grab that specific value, and then I can update it. So again, this is very similar to what Weston was saying with Mapbox layers. All I'm doing is I'm grabbing the map context, and I'm updating the layer. So in this case, it's set data is like a Mapbox way of updating data within a layer. And that's pretty much like how that piece works. And so with all of this, the nice thing is that we can return back to like people with a solution. And so Sammy is really happy because everything works. And so Sammy has basically the master is, wait, what was it? The protege has become the master, something like that. And so Sammy now speaks in like wise cryptic terms. And so there is no cloud, there is just someone else's server, which is very like, heartening because you don't have to care about uptime. You don't have to be on call, which is great. And so that gives Sammy a lot of power. That gives anyone who uses this workflow a lot of power because it gives you the ability to build systems without having to worry about making sure that they're up all the time. And so with that, thank you so much for your attention. This is the GitHub repo where everything is available. Yeah.